Good evening and welcome to another Durham Castle lecture. And it's a positive pleasure, delight, honor, privilege to introduce Rowan Williams this evening, who will be talking to the title, The Tree of Knowledge, Bodies, Minds, and Thoughts. Now, there is very little I can say by way of introduction to Rowan Williams that you probably don't already know, but I'll just highlight a few points. Rowan is, of course, an Anglican bishop, poet, and theologian. He was the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury from December 2002 to December 2012. He was previously Bishop of Monmouth and Archbishop of Wales, apparently making him the first Archbishop of Canterbury in modern times not to be appointed within the Church of England. He spent much of his early career as an academic at the universities in Oxford and Cambridge. Apart from Welsh, nota bene, he speaks and reads 9 other languages. Rowan stood down as Archbishop of Canterbury on the 31st of December 2012 and became Master of Magdelene College at Cambridge University in January 2013. To give you the sense of the range of his remarkable writings, he's the author of, and I've just picked a few to give you that sense of scope, Dostoevsky, Language, Faith and Fiction, a foreword to W.H. Auden's in Great Poets of the 20th Century series, Where God Happens, Discovering Christ in One Another, Wrestling with Angels, Conversations in Modern Theology, Why Study the Past, The Quest for the Historical Church, the poems of Rowan Williams, on Christian theology, faith in the university. It's a truly extraordinary range, and it is a great experience for me and for all of us, Rowan Williams, to have you here this evening. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much indeed for such a warm and generous welcome, both on this occasion and throughout the day. It's always a delight to be in Durham, and a great delight to have the chance of thinking aloud with you a bit this evening about the issue of how we think about knowing. Why this subject? Like a good many people in the academic world in the last couple of years, I've been very much marked and interested by the work of Mcgilchrist, whose enormous book, The Master and His Emissary, offers an analysis of the history of Western culture in the last few centuries, based on the assumption that we are seriously, if not dangerously, misunderstanding the nature of our whole mental life in our current culture. The Master and His Emissary is a book written by somebody who, unusually, is trained both in English literature and in neuroscience, and has also been a practicing therapist. We need a few more people, I think, with that particular crossover of skills at the moment. The neuroscience enables him to write very intelligently about the ways in which the hemispheres of the brain operate. The English literature qualification enables him to think quite a lot about the way in which the fiction, the poetry, and the visual art of the last few hundred years might suggest a gradual shift in how we think about thinking. And the therapist, of course, suggests some of what might need to be done about it. In a nutshell, for those of you who haven't come across this book, the thesis runs something like this. While it's clearly an oversimplification to think that the two hemispheres of the brain work in isolation or in totally different ways, the fact remains that the two hemispheres privilege certain kinds of thinking, certain kinds of figuring and mapping of the world we're in. The left brain, which is generally the more analytic, the more pattern-making, the more connection-making at the micro level, the more problem-solving bit of the brain, is a crucial element in identifying, on a fairly small scale, what specific challenges are and what specific responses are needed. It's reactive. It's something which breaks down to smaller rather than building up to larger patterns. And so far as it goes, it's one of the things that makes us the competent homines habiles that we are, the handy people, people who know how to do things with things. The right brain, on the other hand, which is less linked into certain kinds of linguistic skills, builds larger models. It sees larger horizons. It makes connections that are not just argumentative or functional or practical. It scans the horizon. It risks putting phenomena together in what may be unexpected patterns. It's, in certain ways, more patient of, more capable of working with particular kinds of physical habit and learning. When you're learning how to ride a bike or play a cello, it may be the right brain rather than the left that is more deeply engaged. In the ideal world, which we've probably never occupied, the left brain is the emissary, in Ian Mcgilchrist's terms. It does the work for the larger pattern-building enterprise of the right brain. When things are going badly wrong, the left brain, the analytic and problem-solving side of us, takes over in ways that end up shrinking our horizons, reducing our capacity to formulate and understand the very problems that we're out to solve. And Mcgilchrist believes that it's that imbalance that we currently suffer from. Now, some of that very ambitious, wide-ranging and broad-brush analysis is part of what I'm taking for granted in outlining my case this evening. Because I want to reflect particularly not just about forms of knowing, but about the role of the body in knowing. One of the things that the left brain can persuade us of is that knowing things is something that happens inside our heads. Inside our heads is a highly developed lighthouse beam, invisible but nonetheless effective. It swivels around from this interior point and lights up problem after problem, situation after situation. It switches on its full strength, and we then activate our capacity in order to resolve the particular problem that is posed to us inside our heads. And what not only Mcgilchrist, but a good many other philosophers and analysts of our contemporary cultural world, I think of the Canadian Philip Shepherd here as well, what a number of these people have said is that brackets out the actual process by which we learn to know most of what we know. And that process of learning is something which we need to attend to if we're not to be stuck with a highly mythological and, at the end of the day, really rather destructive model of what knowing is like. Because the lighthouse beam model will consistently persuade us to draw in our horizons, to concentrate on function rather than vision, and will therefore, at the end of the day, make us less recognizably human to one another than we might otherwise be. So think for a moment of things that you have learned to know. I mentioned a moment ago riding bikes and playing cellos. You might also ask, what is it like to learn a song? Learning how to ride a bicycle or how to sing a song is learning a set of habits which your body activates. You learn to respond or resonate to your environment in a particular way. You learn that if you lean over this way on a bicycle, you fall off. You learn in all sorts of very elusive ways that when you try to activate your vocal cords in this way rather than that, the sound that comes out is not a sound that anybody very much wants to hear. You learn habits. You learn to accommodate yourself to a complex set of stimuli which you probably couldn't ever tabulate in full. People who learn crafts learn very much in this way. They learn by imitation. They learn literally by feeling their way. And a book like Richard Sennett's work, The Craftsman, spells out something of what it means to learn a craft in ways which he argues have very serious and very significant implications for the kind of humanity we grow into. Learning a craft takes you time. It requires a certain kind of forgetting of certain kinds of anxiety. You can't learn how to be, let's say, a woodcarver if you're constantly anxious. Physical tension will be dangerous and destructive for you, and you will not produce what you're meant to be producing. You have, in other words, once again to learn habits, physical habits of unclenching your attention and literally unclenching your muscles. And that issues in a kind of knowledge, a practical knowledge, a knowledge of how to feel your way in the environment. It shouldn't surprise us, of course, because that's how we begin to know anything, if you think about it. I've sometimes ventured the theory that we learn knowledge and language as small children as much as anything by the experience of bumping into things. We gradually map a physical environment in terms of where we go and where we can't go, where if we go we run into something and we can't move on in a straight line. We create for ourselves a mental geography bounded by those physical bits of resistance that gradually take a connected shape. To learn that somebody else is a body is learning literally our way around them. So that level of learning which involves the body acquiring certain habits and imagining certain perspectives, about which I'll have more to say in a moment, that is where our human knowing, it seems, most deeply belongs. It's in the service of some of the specific challenges that arise as a result of that, that the emissary, the left brain, begins its work. If I can't get round that particular obstacle, exactly why can't I? And how do I focus my attention in such a way that there will be a way of getting around it? Now, quite clearly, if we forget the process of our human learning, the way in which learning physical habits is deeply ingrained in or embedded in the body, we will end up with a governing model or paradigm of knowing which, because it is analytical, is in danger of being disembodied, not any longer about feeling our way around. It will no doubt be highly effective in identifying this particular corner of the environment as requiring this particular set of strategies to get through it. It won't tell us what the whole object is, the whole picture is. It won't give us a map as such. And in neurological terms, this has been illustrated with stark and painful clarity by the fact that certain kinds of brain lesion leave people with the capacity to recognize features but not faces. That is, people will know that that is a nose, but they'll be unable to see whose face it is. And that, I think, is quite a helpful metaphor for some of what's problematic in all this. Physical knowing becomes very literally a way of inhabiting an environment. Inhabiting, that is, regularly moving around within. Not everything reduces immediately to a problem, and the knowledge that I have is neither a knowledge of a set of facts nor simply a set of strategies. It's an acquaintance, a capacity to imagine, to create or postulate how the resistance that is around me actually looks overall. Without that, as I say, our concept of what's human, and thus our concept of our culture, thins out very dramatically. And the case made by Mcgilchrist, Shepherd, and others is that that thinning out is not only about a kind of incompetence at building larger pictures of our physical environment, but that it also has to do with building larger pictures of our emotional environment. The more we are fixated on problem solving, the more we are fixated on control. The more frustration and lack of control or failure to solve problems creates personal challenges for us, and the more we're inclined to lash out because of frustration. There is again a fair bit of evidence from that neurological world about the connections between violence, obsession, and control. And even more broadly, and a little less poisonously, we can say that it issues in an impatience with taking time over anything. That may sound faintly familiar as a portrait of cultures that you and I have doubtless inhabited with some regularity. But I think it's possible to map all of that onto some aspects of our social, cultural, and indeed political world at the moment in ways that can be illuminating. We are notoriously subject to short attention spans in contemporary culture. And I don't just mean the average length of an episode in a television drama. I mean also the average length of time that a story lasts in the media, or indeed the average reach that a declaration of government policy may envisage. We are short-termist, it seems, almost by compulsion these days. We're encouraged to assume that the solving of the problem immediately in front of us is what matters, and we lose track of larger questions about the meaning of our social institutions, the purpose of our social institutions in the long term, impatient of understanding exactly how we got here. And I think one of the most interesting and troubling things about our contemporary culture is a point that was flagged up a year or so ago in a very interesting document that some of you may have seen by Joe Goldie and David Armitage, the History Manifesto, which spoke about the way in which the thinning out of historical knowledge in general, and not least, I'm afraid, in some institutions of higher education, meant that we had now an impatience in regard of understanding how we got here. If we don't know how we got here, we will tend to assume that where we are is obvious. If we assume that where we are is obvious, we are less likely to ask critical questions about it. The less likely we are to ask critical questions about it, the more resistant we will be to other people's challenges to it. In other words, not understanding how we learned to be the people we now are has an immediate and highly dangerous effect on the kind of society we are and might seek to be, just as it would have a dangerous effect on any one of us who wish to block out the memory of the experiences that have, as a matter of fact, made us the people we are. So we're not just talking about philosophical theory here. We are talking about attitudes to knowing and learning which do have some measurable effect, some measurable significance for the sort of society we are and think we are and might want to be, for where we think we might be going, for what we take for granted. But one more point before I move on about minds and bodies. I've emphasized so far how very important it is that we understand a great deal of our habitual learning in terms of the body acquiring the habits it needs to move around in an environment without bumping into too many things. How the acquiring of habits of feeling, sensing, participating is crucial to growing in knowledge. But the other side of that coin is, strangely, that the body itself becomes something much more deeply imbued with mind. If the mind is emphatically something we learn as bodies, the very notion of a body takes for granted something about mind. It was, predictably, a German philosopher of about 100 years ago who first seems to have noticed that it's philosophically interesting that we can't see the backs of our heads. That's to say, she argued, and interestingly it was a she, that's to say that for us to have an image of ourselves as a body, as a three-dimensional unit in space, requires us to listen to and attend to what other people are doing with respect to us. There's something that the other knows that I absolutely can't. That is, what the back of my head looks like head on, so to speak. Expand that in various ways, and of course you see how it applies not only in the physical construction of a picture of the construction of a physical picture of myself, but certain aspects of the construction of a mental or psychological picture of myself. I cannot know myself alone. I cannot invent language for myself. I have to be spoken to. I cannot picture myself as a body or a self unless I am seen and engaged with. And in that sense, the philosopher in question claims that aspects of empathy are essential to our processes of knowing. Empathy, that is, the imaginative identification with a perspective not my own, is not just an optional extra in our human identity and our human repertoire. It's something without which we cannot know ourselves. Without identification with the other, I don't know myself. A footnote. The philosopher in question was the very remarkable Edith Stein, one of the first women to do graduate work in philosophy in a German university, the secretary and assistant of the great phenomenological philosopher Edmund Husserl, a convert from Judaism to Roman Catholicism, who died in Auschwitz as a Carmelite nun. None of that means that she was a good philosopher, but she was a good philosopher, as it happens, who coincidentally is also a saint. It's nice to know that that can sometimes come together. But her point, I think, holds. That is, that just as it's impossible for us to think mind without body, it turns out rather surprisingly to be impossible to think body without mind. That's to say, to think body without the engagement and the exchange of intelligent subjects, without the imaginative projection of self into the other. Our knowing, in other words, is not only bodily, it's also cooperative. And going back to the lighthouse in the brain model, the problem with that is not only that it is dangerously on the way to being disembodied, it's also highly individualized. And if we want to redress the balance in certain ways in thinking about how we know and what it is to know, we will need not only to reinstate the connectedness of body and mind, but to find something interesting to say about the cooperative character of the enterprise of knowing itself. So, to move on a little, Knowledge, understood in these terms of relatedness to body and interchange and language, knowledge appears to be less the fixing on and identifying of an object that can be analyzed exhaustively and, so to speak, absorbed into the knower. It turns out to have rather more to do with, to use what I admit is a favorite metaphor of mine, something rather more to do with attunement. To be on a wavelength. To be aware that there are stimuli coming into us which, as embodied minds or intelligent bodies, we are learning to vibrate to. If I were being a little bit too epigrammatic for my own good, I would suggest perhaps that knowledge in this connection involves attention and attunement and atonement. It involves a highly developed capacity to be absorbed by, not just to absorb, attention. It requires an awareness of how we resonate with and adjust to the stimuli that are coming into us as bodies, as intelligent bodies. It requires, finally, what I'm calling atonement. That is, the capacity to be, in some important sense, at one with an environment of stimuli, agenda, suggestion, and all the rest. And only that particular bundle of skills, or indeed, you might say graces, amounts to real practical intelligence. So, two subsidiary questions of some interest to me, and I hope to you, both in the role of someone with a theological interest and somebody with an academic interest. Let's take the academic interest first. In our teaching, at every level, what are the kinds of knowledge we privilege? What are the kinds of knowledge we seek to nurture and encourage and develop? And how far do our institutions allow us to have the binocular vision, both hemispheres of the brain, that it seems we need in order to be intelligent? Conversation over the dinner table this evening suggested that anxieties over some of the culture of higher education and not so higher education these days were quite widely shared around the place, and I dare say that's the case. And part of that anxiety surely has to do with a sense that certain models of knowledge, analytic, short-term, binary and problem solving, are in danger in some areas of elbowing out certain other kinds of attunement or even atonement, certain kinds of attentiveness. I think it's a fair complaint, and a complaint that does indeed go right the way through the educational system. We've been used for decades, of course, to a number of experiments in educational method which have reminded us that there are other kinds of approach to the education, let's say, of primary school children than simply a set of easily checkable skills acquired in strict succession, tested relentlessly. Whether in Steiner schools or Montessori schools, or simply schools that have learned certain lessons, there's been an awareness that to nurture children in intelligence, in the sense in which I've been using the word, requires more consideration than is usually given to how the body works intelligently, to the embodied mind, in fact. Which is why play, music, sport, leisure, drama all have so crucial a role in the formation of the intelligent child. And while most primary schools in our country hold on to some version of that, it's to me very interesting and rather puzzling that they're clearly thought no longer to be worth attending to once the child has turned 11 years old. From that point on, it appears other models of knowledge predominate increasingly. And predominate, of course, in a way which has led us for quite a long time, let's not idealize the past here, for quite a long time, to undervalue, disvalue those elements of craft learning which require sophistication of intelligence, patience, and, dare I say it, spiritual maturity. The demise of apprenticeships in British education is not just a casual, regrettable fact about the way in which industry works. I suspect it also has something to say about what kind of learning we think really counts. Well, there's a good deal more that could be said about the educational establishment and the educational philosophy we are currently used to. But I think the point is fairly made here. But I want to go on to say a little bit about the theological implications as well, since that is one of the things that for quite a lot of my life I've been paid to do. Let me go to what may seem a rather unlikely locus for thinking about these subjects, and that is the writings of St Augustine. In years gone by, my students would sometimes say they'd never heard me give a talk in which St Augustine didn't feature at some point, and I'm very happy to maintain that stereotype. But one of the most interesting bits of argumentation in St Augustine's autobiographical reflections in the Confessions has to do, in fact, with knowledge and learning. He describes famously in the 7th book of his Confessions how he struggled to attain spiritual knowledge, how he followed sacrificially and devotedly a path of mental abstraction and inwardness to put him in touch with eternal verities. And he describes how that didn't quite seem to work in breaking his habits, in changing his life, in acquainting him with a living truth, such as he was seeking for. And he has an extraordinarily powerful image in Book 7 of how frustrated and pained by his failure in connecting up his ordinary daily life with the experience of mental abstraction and elevated contemplation, he finally gave himself up to the Christian faith, throwing himself down, he says, on the divinity that was stretched out at his feet. For Augustine, the way up is the way down. That's to say, learning anything about the spirit, the spiritual realm, let alone God, involves a way down. It involves a recognition of one's own mortality and physicality. It involves, for him specifically as a Christian, the recognition that God has spoken and acted in a very particular social, historical, and material context. That is, in the life of Jesus. And that image of throwing oneself down in order, as Augustine says, that we may rise with the rising of Christ, that is not a bad metaphor for some of what we've been thinking about this evening. Though, of course, for some of us in this room, it's rather more than just a helpful metaphor for rethinking epistemology. But it's a helpful metaphor, at least, because it's about the way in which our human mental processes and spiritual processes are perpetually seduced by the model of escape and the model of control. Mysteriously, we as human beings would quite like not to be material a lot of the time. And At its most marked, you see that in some of the rhetoric of what we've learned to call the transhumanist discussions, which imagine what it might be like for us to be, if not literally vats in jars, at least something rather like that. That is, for the informational content of our systems to be transferable from container to container, and therefore to be guaranteed an immortality of some kind. Whether that's more than science fiction is debatable, but whether or not it's science fiction, the aspiration, the dream of liberty from the body is an intriguing one, a puzzling one in our history. And as I say, lest we imagine that there was somewhere a golden age of integration, it's a dream whose roots are very, very deep in our past as a culture, as a Christian culture, as a Platonic culture, as a classical culture. And I dare say it's not just a European problem. But if the sketch that I've offered is in anything like the right territory, then there is something about our embodiedness and about the kinds of exchange that bodies have, which is intrinsic to intelligence itself, or at least, to put it a little less loadedly, what we would have to mean by intelligence would have to be very different were it not so involved in the exchange and confrontation and encounter of bodies, and therefore with the taking of time. The dream so often seems to reduce to that persistent aspiration that there could be ways of knowledge, ways of knowing, ways of mastery, which didn't depend on the contingencies of taking time, on the labor of finding one's way around, and indeed, therefore, on the difficulty of inhabiting our environment. And that's one of the last points I want to underline here. Difficulty. I think difficulty is good for us. And I say that not just as an excuse for writing some of the books I've written, which I'm told are not always easy reading. I say it because difficulty is one of those things which obliges us to take time, rather obviously. The more time we take, the more our discovery is likely to turn into habit and inhabiting. The less time we take over something, the easier we find something to resolve, map, and digest, the less value, the less significance it'll have. It's actually rather an old chestnut. Platonic philosophers and early Christian theologians were saying millennia ago that the more easily you thought you'd got to know something, the less you'd care about it. Difficulty imposes a discipline. It imposes a willingness to believe that there is more to work on. And in that sense also, of course, by reminding us that getting to where we are has taken time, it can also be one of those things that reminds us that our cultural perspective, temporal or geographical, is not the only obvious one. Taking time, the awareness of the more that we have not yet absorbed, may be one of the things, maybe, it doesn't absolutely have to be, but it may be one of the things that gives us that little bit more patience with the criticism, the challenge, the alternative view of another world, another culture, another person. It may be, mysteriously, one of those things that builds solidarity rather than division. In other words, that extends the cooperation that properly belongs to knowledge. Once again, there's a theological flicker in the background, something to do with the relationship between knowledge and communion, but that would perhaps be for another occasion. Enough for now just to underline the potential positive significance of difficulty. We need, in our inhabiting of the world, it seems, to take very seriously the fact that the world resists being controlled and digested by human subjects. We repeatedly act as if control and digestion were the only things that mattered, and that, of course, explains a great deal about the ecological crisis which we currently face. But if we return to that centrality of time and difficulty and embodied labour, there is really no way round grasping the fact that we as bodies belong in a world where bodily processes are something we share, not something to which we are superior. That in itself imposes on us a more patient, a more attentive, should we say even a more reverent approach to the environment we live in. There's no great novelty in making the point, but it may as well be made. How we think knowledge works affects how we approach our environment. If our model of knowledge is the lighthouse in the brain, there is that much more risk of supposing that the knowing subject is so very, very different from anything out there to be known that there is a fixed gulf between the human and the non-human. And that is surely one of the things which we are having to learn to go beyond in our inhabiting of a world of limited resources and increasing instability. The Tree of Knowledge. I chose the title partly because it's an image that religious people are familiar with, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. And whether or not the writer of Genesis had this in mind, there is clearly one way of plucking the fruit of the tree of knowledge which has as bad an effect now as it did in 4004 BC, on the first occasion when things began to go wrong for Adam and Eve. But the tree of knowledge is also a peculiarly resonant image in other ways. It's intriguing, of course, that when people talk about neurophysiology, they talk, among other things, about dendritic elements in the brain, tree-like elements. The proliferation and spreading of antennae within particular neuron structures. Interesting also that the notion of trees with crowns above the ground and roots beneath has again and again returned as a metaphor for what we know and what we don't know we know. Interesting that a late classical philosopher like Porphyry could discuss the variants of logical method in terms of a tree. There is, it seems, something about the organic life of a tree which compulsively draws or attracts to itself thinking about knowledge. And to think about knowledge particularly in terms of that above and below ground model, what we know, and what we don't know we know. Apologies to Donald Rumsfeld and others. To think of knowledge in those terms is, I'd say, not only a helpful, but perhaps even a saving reminder of the risks of reducing what we mean by knowledge to a certain set of skills and capacities, the risk of forgetting that what we know comes from where we are, and where we are takes time to get to, the risk of failing to inhabit our world, and thus to inhabit our bodies. And as I've suggested, the risk involved there is not simply the risk of a worrying philosophical mistake, but something more like the risk of what we might mean to be human at all. Thank you.
pause for thought. Dazzling. I'll take questions this evening, I think just one at a time, in order perhaps to create a better basis for conversation with Rowan Williams. And we have a roaming mic. I'm going to give you back then. Do you want to come sit down, or you prefer to stand up? Yeah. Let me give you back the mic.
Shall I hang on to it? Yes?
Yeah.
Right.
So questions from the front, and let's go back.
All clear?
Yes.
Yes. Front row.
As you might say, you are.
Yeah, I'm Pietro Maffettoni from the School of Government here at Durham. I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm afraid I've seen a lot of myself and what I do during the day through the lenses of what you were saying. So what I wanted to ask is this. I mean, coming from a politics department, I wonder whether you think that what you have described as a current way of understanding how we know things is something which is just naturally happening, or whether you think there is something that is happening by design, and whether there is some sort of winners and losers from this kind of process. Because I have the feeling that it's the kind of incentives that our institutions give us, and it's a project which actually is not simply neutral.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A project that's not simply neutral. I think that's right. I don't want to get into a conspiracy theory about this, as if, there's some sinister little group underneath a mountain in Switzerland organizing all this. You never know. But I think there comes to be a kind of cyclic feedback effect in all this. We create superbly competent problem-solving tools, not just technological ones, but also ideological and theoretical ones. Because of their superb problem-solving qualities, we are easily persuaded to think that the important problems are the ones we can solve that way. Once we've decided that, there is an incentive built in to identifying the problems we're going to focus on, and therefore the questions for which we'll need more of that kind of technological and theoretical input, and so the feedback continues. And because we're also at the moment, as a society, just a bit neurotic about accountability, for understandable reasons, and because this mode gives us some quite easy metrics for accountability, once again it looks so straightforward. We can actually do this. And because we're in a society where can usually equals must, then yes, we are incentivized in this way. Which is why, let me raise the red banner, and why I think universities ought to be actively engaged in discussions of what counts as knowledge, and keeping this anxiety very much on the radar of our culture and our politics.
If I may just, I think that's a good explanation. But I think also that without being conspiracy theorists, there are very specific groups and institutions that win as a result of this process, and others who lose. And so you may wonder whether the effort is at times very much conscious rather than simply the result of advantages brought about by this process.
Yes. Again, I doubt whether too much discussion of rival philosophies of mind is going on in some of the boardrooms, but that there's some deliberation about it. Yes, I remember reading, quite a few years ago, an article in a noted weekly political journal about the need for replacing more teachers with more computers. Now, more computers in the classroom is a good idea. Replacing teachers with computers seems to me just a little bit more problematic. Because computers, of course, are brilliantly successful binary systems where there's always a one or the other response. Most teaching that's interesting doesn't reduce to that, in spite of the popularity of multiple choice questions as a form of examination these days, about which, again, I could wax very eloquent. But, computers are made by people who make money from them. And it'd be very nice for some people if that were accepted. I may say by way of footnote that although I don't normally write letters to weekly journals or indeed daily newspapers, I did on that occasion.
Gillian Rees from the Philosophy Department here at Durham. You mentioned, and I think something that is very important, the embodiment of our knowledge and the importance of the relation of our minds to our bodies for knowing. Also the relation of us to others and the importance of that for knowing. But one aspect you only touched upon in your answer to the last question was the relation of us or our minds to material things, which seems to me equally important. Just think of the ability of writing things down, the ability to manipulate our environments, the ability to store memories in external things. And it seems to me that, in particular for churches, this is important, because churches make so much of sort of material embodiment of memory, of knowledge, and so on. And I was wondering if you could comment on this.
Thank you. That's a wonderful thought. I think, again, I'd go back to somebody like Richard Sennett writing about craft, because the way he approaches it, not wholly unlike the way somebody like Simone Weil discusses it in some of her work, is that there are ways in which our own embodiment can, as it were, extend itself in both the technology of information recording and of information storage. Simone Weil uses the very simple example of the pencil at the end of the finger. Is it or isn't it part of my body? Well, for certain purposes, it is an aspect of my embodied engagement. And I think that the symbolic codes, the embodied symbolic codes that we inhabit, certainly as religious believers, but also in other ways, reinforce the point. If you attempt to imagine a culture, religious or secular, without some kind of symbolic embodiments in it, it's really quite hard. Our cultural environment codes a past, reminds us of possibilities, and if it doesn't do that, well, I don't quite see that it's a culture at all. So, yes, there's a lot more one could say about that, and a lot more one could say also, though this is a much more ambitious subject in some ways, a lot one could say about the ways in which material itself, so to speak, reaches into our own mental, embodied condition. That's another story.
Thank you. Alec Ryrie from Theology and Religion. I'm not sure I have so much a question as a theme to throw at you, which is death and illness and failure. If we're thinking of embodiment, yes, then this is the sorts of things that happens with bodies. Yes. And I suppose if I have a question about that, it's how that relates to the ways that intelligence fails and our incapacity in that sense. If we're thinking of intelligence as this embodied, then how do we think of the death of intelligence, or the way that bodily death relates to the life of the mind?
Right, that's... Goodness, yes, that's a very large one. I must, again, bear with me, think aloud in response to that, rather. Okay, well, first of all, then, I think that insofar as we are looking at knowledge as something that takes time, that is embodied in the ways I discussed, we're also bound to recognize that what we are going to know is finite, because our bodies are not infinitely extensible systems. We won't go on learning forever, unless you have a particular 4th century Cappadocian doctrine of eternal extension in the afterlife, which is interesting in itself, but perhaps not to be discussed immediately here. But as far as our present embodiment is concerned, there is a point at which we stop learning things because we die. And I think one of the challenges that we face in thinking intelligently about intelligence is the recognition that we are not only inhabiting a material world, but we're inhabiting perhaps an ongoing cultural world in which the limit or the term of our knowing and our learning is part of something larger than ourselves. That's not, I hope, to go into the sentimentality of, I die but the cause endures, so much as to recognize the bare fact, which some writers like Hannah Arendt have rather underlined, that we are born into a continuing conversation, and we make our contribution, and naturally the conversation continues. So that the mortality of our condition and the finitude of our intelligence emphatically doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile, or that the only way in which we could take all that seriously would be living forever or constantly hopping from vehicle to vehicle for our intelligence to go on expanding. Once again, there's something about the locatedness, the relationality of our bodily life, which is what our intelligence as human beings actually is. But that's really just a sort of duff-my-head response to a huge question, which is well worth thinking further about. Anybody further back in the hall? I'm just conscious of a thank you, a sea of silent faces.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm from the astronomy department, and I'm also an amateur woodworker. I was wondering, to what extent do you think culture self-writes itself? Because if you go back maybe 15 years, to use beer as a good example, finding a craft beer would have been very difficult. But that has become a lot more easy as time's gone by. If you go into shops on high streets anywhere in the UK, you'll find small shops selling crafted items, and in particular in woodwork, you'll find that designs have got more rudimentary to appear obviously handcrafted. To what extent do you think that this is a self-writing process?
Yes, I'd like to think that there was a self-writing process involved here, because you're right, of course, there has been a little bit of a shift. I just, on my way to the station this morning, looking at an advertisement for artisan cheeses as I passed a shop in Cambridge and thinking, artisan cheese? I suppose I know what that means. Certainly not the kind of cheese eaten by artisans on the hill, because they can't afford it these days. So yes, there are elements that return. My worry is twofold, I think. One is, of course, that craft returns as luxury. That is, as peripheral, as eccentric, as quaint, and desirable as a consumer good of a very particular niche kind, which I think means that a developed, sophisticated, technological capitalist economy will always have room for artisan cheeses. But the culture itself, as it were, rewards things other than the making of artisan cheeses, because the person buying the artisan cheese is a person who has made their living and learned their learning in other ways. That's one of my worries. The other is, I think, and in that there are also all kinds of class considerations too, but let's not go there. But the other thing is that the rate of change and the level of change in technological capacity and communicative ability is so rapid that self-writing mechanisms will have to be rather different and rather more nimble than they've been in the past. culture is now amazingly nimble. You know, it skips from mountaintop to mountaintop like a wild goat. And whereas you can look back beyond 15 years and say, yes, well, balances do even out a bit. Is there a point at which we really do forget how to, whatever it is, how to take the time? There are, and Ian Mcgilchrist mentioned some of this, there are some areas where it does seem we are now much slower in learning certain things than our ancestors were, just as we're much quicker at many other things. And that's not necessarily a writing of balance, that's possibly something pushing faster and faster in one direction rather than another. So I'd like to think you're right, and I hope and pray, but I'm not too optimistic about that. Or at least I think I think we still have cause to say, whoa, let's think about this one. Anybody else at the back? Oh yes, right at the back. Yes, I'm so sorry. The microphone seemed to come and go rather a lot. I hope I got it. Yes. You're speaking as a physicist, I think you said. Yes. And the differences between... Sorry, I'm just seeing if I've got the question. Differences between the computerized model of input and output and the different kinds of engagement that human encounter might entail, and the different time scales involved in that. Something of that? So I think if what we're interested in learning or becoming an expert about is not simply the mastery of a set of operations or a set of functions, but a capacity to both to make unpredicted connections and to see where connections aren't being made and might be. It's the latter which seems to me to have the longer rhythm, the longer time scale, because it's not easily reduced to input-output questions. So my interest in expertise, whether in science, in any form, any one of the sciences, or in the humanities, my interest, I think, is in the expert who is capable of asking the fresh question, which is not simply there to be picked out by the data. Within the data as they're assembled. So that, I think, is why what we call expertise is likely to be a bit more than just mastery of data. And I think what we'd recognize in an expert is something more like that capacity, to use the analogy again, to walk around, to look at what is not being connected that might be, to look at the suggestions that arise, and to tabulate the unanswered questions and look at the shape of the lack of answer. And in my mind there is, and it's an example I've often quoted, visiting the Sanger Institute near Cambridge some years ago to look at the genome patterning work that was being done there, and looking at the charts with the enormous and suggestive gaps, and people saying, well, that's where the interest lies. We can do the processing, and then we're left with making sense of where the gaps are and why. And that's expertise, I think. Okay.
Hello, my name's Graham. I'm a speech and language therapist. I was interested that you mentioned that empathy is potentially an important potentiality in understanding ourselves through an understanding of other. Do you have any advice about the best ways to go about teaching an up-and-coming generation to be empathetic?
Yes, thank you. Well, I've noticed that empathy is now the sort of subject on which you see books at station bookstores. And I take it from that a real cultural breakthrough has occurred. There's a book recently called, I think, Adventures in Empathy or something like that, which made my blood run cold a little. Yes, there are several assumptions there I'd want to quarrel with. But how do we do it? Well, it's a bit obvious to say it, but I'll say it. I do think that narrative and drama continue to play a crucially important part in this. By which I don't just mean what people learn in English classes. I mean that narrative, whether it's historical or indeed scientific or whatever else, narrative is something which, because it quite simply shows how you get from X to Y, invites someone to say, well, there is a movement, there is a process. Our minds are shaped. And to watch someone else's mind being shaped is to learn something about myself. Now, in the world of, drama and the creative arts, there's a very specific kind of shaping involved, but I do think it's crucially important. And without wanting to privilege unduly something that I admit I do care about quite a lot, I would like to see our educational institutions working at the kind of empathy, nourishing drama that will move us forward in this respect. And I think that also fleshes out in what we do to assist people students at primary and secondary level, to inhabit another's perspective. I recently I didn't have to, I chose to and enjoyed it, to act as a judge for a young people's writing competition in South Wales. And part of the agenda they'd been given was empathetic, if you like. They had to write in the person of. And I was delighted with what came through, because I could see that while some of them were going through the motions, some of them really had worked very hard about occupying someone else's stance. And I thought, well, that's how it should be. That's what schools ought to be encouraging. And it's more than just, I think, learning that, there's always somebody else's point of view. It's also learning that somebody else's point of view just could be yours, or you could at least understand a bit what it's like to have another point of view. And this, sorry, I've got me on a hobby horse now, but this, I think, is of some interest, to put it mildly, in the way in which we approach the teaching of religion, in which you'd expect me to have some interest. I worry occasionally that even when there's quite a lot of quite good teaching about religion in some bits of our educational curriculum, there's sometimes a little bit of an empathy gap. What's it actually like to live that sort of life, to have those sorts of values? And that, of course, does mean that in our culture as a whole, when we come up against people who have marked and sometimes very marked religious convictions that put them at odds with the rest of society, sometimes violently, sometimes just more routinely, we just reflect a sort of unwillingness and inability to see, well, what does it feel like? What might it be like? And I'd have an awful lot more practitioners coming in to talk in religious studies classes. But yeah, I won't ramble on, but it is about that sort of imaginative exercise. Inhabit not only your own position, but someone else's. Because actually, without an awareness of that, you won't have a full awareness of your own.
Thank you. Listening to you speaking, Rowan, I was just trying to think about the implications of what you were saying for the nature of our political knowledge in a democracy. Because politicians are trading forms of knowledge all the time, but it is inherently limited by the democratic process, to appealing to jurisdictions, to the short-term fluctuations of electoral cycles, for the knowledge that most people's votes won't change, but in the middle there are a few floating constituencies that everything has to be focused on. I mean, I mean, it seems to me, from what you've been saying, that most modern democracies live out their life, as it were, in a very particular narrow version of what you've been talking about. But I would like to ask you, what would a democracy like, or what would political knowledge be like, or what would political leadership be like that reached to the greater ambitions of thinking and knowledge that you've been talking about?
So basically, how do we change everything? Yes. No, I hear the question.
Can you have political leaders, who are, in other words, who are able to marshal various kinds of political knowledge that isn't, right from the outset, inherently, short-termist and narrow in the sense that, technocratic in the sense that you were talking about?
Well, I worry very much about the future of political leadership, and that's, it's not a particular personal complaint about the leaders we've got, it's about the entire culture they inhabit or fail to inhabit, and the ways in which democracy has come to be narrowed, thinned, trivialized, and almost evacuated of any content except for kind of plebiscite of opinions. What do we do about it? I don't quite know what to do about political leadership, except the rather draconian suggestion that nobody ought to be allowed to be leader of a political party unless they've had 10 years of doing something serious outside politics. But more broadly, I think we have to give quite a bit of attention to what we do to nourish those forms of local democracy, that is accountable self-administration at grassroots level. I'm one of those people who is rather a fan of community organizing and some of what goes with that. But what are the contexts in which people learn political intelligence and political maturity? Some decades ago, there were quite a number of local contexts in which I think you could have said, yes, that you could come up that way, you could come up that way. And that landscape has, I think, been flattened out quite a bit recently. Again, there's the death of intermediate institutions and professions and all the rest of it, but also of some local self-starting, self-regulating communities. And the second thing is that I guess we need to think quite hard about what the institutions are in our society at the wider, the national level, that keep certain questions going between and beyond electoral cycles. I like to think that it's still just possible that the Church has a role somewhere in there. I like also to think, and again, I wouldn't I, that the House of Lords, when it's doing its job, has something to do with that. And of course the universities. There are institutions in our society that are supposed to be thinking longer thoughts. And because there are issues, and my favorite example is the reform of the penal system, because there are issues that are never going to be vote winners, somebody's got to hold the corner for them. And that's where we look, I think, to those institutions.
Anybody else would like to ask a last question? Glider, apparently you'd like to ask a last question.
Hi, Glider Hernandez at the law school. Something in your lecture seemed to suggest a call for a certain modesty in our capacity for rationalism, or in the way that we apply our rationalism. I was wondering to what extent you can also resist becoming paralyzed by that modesty and humility, especially in the face of people who don't necessarily have that modesty and are very, very ideological in pushing their views forward.
Yes. I think you're right that I would want to suggest a certain reticence about the claims of rationality as we usually conceive it. There's a very interesting history to be written of what the word rational has meant since, let's say, the 11th century. And it's shifted quite a bit over that period. But I take it that the question really is something to do with how a modest or agnostic or provisional spirit, accepting the need for the other, the limit of the self, how that copes with a system, whether violently rationalist or violently anti-rationalist, which simply denies the provisionality. And I don't have a magic bullet for that. Insofar as there is any conversation to open up, I think once again it's possibly on the level of narrative. If I'm stuck with the person who comes at me with a very strongly unprovisional approach, whether it's, I don't know, a militant Islamic activist, or for that matter, a militant secularist, I will want to ask the question at some point, if I'm allowed to get a word in edgeways, so where does this come from? What's your story? Because as soon as you begin to say, well, how did you get there, something opens up that's a little bit less completely sealed. Now, the difficulty is, and a Muslim activist of the kind I've described would almost certainly say, well, the truth was given at a particular point in history, and nothing that's happened between then and now has made any difference. So, nothing to talk about. And there are certain kinds of secular rationalists who would say the truth was given in sort of 1700 and something, probably in Königsberg, to Immanuel Kant, and nothing much has happened in between then and now to make any difference either, because it's obvious, isn't it? Any person with any sense can see that it's obvious. And then, well, that's probably the point at which you wait for culture to self-correct itself, or just. But insofar as you can have a conversation, I'd want to say, yeah, but exactly how do you get here, and exactly what conversation is possible for you within your own circle. What do you talk about among each other? What do you talk about to each other? Because if everything's obvious, there's nothing to talk about. And that's a rather bleak prospect for the human future.
Look, there's one more question at the back. Do you want to come forward, and so we don't bring the mic down to you now? Because this will be the very last question.
You can have mine.
Can everybody hear? Politicians usually, when discussing the topic of immigration, like to wax lyrical about what they describe as British values and the importance of immigrants to our society, of assimilating these things. And it often seems to be a rather mythical and a concept that lacks substance generally. But can there be any kind of useful purpose to attempting to get an entire society or an entire people to have a universal set of abjectly defined knowledge, or is that largely useless or even dangerous, and are we better off just going off in our own directions and thinking like that?
Thank you. The last question is notoriously always the most difficult. Is it possible, is it a good thing for a society to have convergent or universally shared values and knowledge systems? Well, let's see. First of all, I think one of the things that that is part of the glue of a cohesive society is that we sort of know what counts as a good argument. Because if we're not able to get some sort of convergence about that, we do retreat into ghettos, and somebody, usually a rather aggressive political power, has to broker all the quarrels that result from that. Whereas a society that's less in need of that constant brokerage and treaty formation ought to be able to recognize at least what counts, even if they don't agree. So I think some sort of common social reason, to put it in those terms, is not a silly or an impossible aspiration. It's going to be strained, of course, the more diverse societies are, naturally. And in the world we're in at the moment, with porous national and cultural boundaries, it's not going to get easier in a hurry. But I think, to be optimistic for once, that actually the experience of this society in the UK is not too bad in terms of multiculturalism. It's possibly not all that popular or fashionable to say that, but it's not too bad. It could be a damn sight worse. Because I do think that we have, in some ways, negotiated in the last few decades an immense upheaval in the level of cohesion or homogeneity in our society, and it could have been a lot worse. So I'm inclined to think it's worth trying and it can be done. The values question is, of course, a lot more difficult, and I get actually rather impatient sometimes with the language of values and British values and non-British values and all the rest of it. Valuing is a verb before it's anything to do with a noun. What we think is worthwhile. And if we ask, well, what do British people think is worthwhile? That's perhaps an easier way of getting at the question, what are British values? I don't think there's a little cluster of things called British values laid up in heaven. I think there are some things that our society, our British society, generally thinks are worthwhile, like the rule of law, and football, and but that being said, I think what we have to be careful about is to get that question the right way round. So instead of saying, what are British values and how do we get everybody in Britain to sign up to British values, we say, what does our society think is worthwhile and why? How do we nourish the convergences and coincidences of what people think is worthwhile in such a way that, again, good conversations keep happening? And I think that's a more constructive way of putting the question. Otherwise, we end up with this sort of abstract set of things that we expect people to conform to when we measure other people's values against, and I think we end up in a rather sterile debate there. It's a very good question there.
Well, before I thank our speaker, just a note about the next lecture, which is not entirely unrelated to this evening. It's on the 4th of March, Professor Dame Jocelyn Bell Bernal on the universe and us. So she's a renowned physicist reflecting on our place in the universe, which is raises a series of questions not unlike some of the ones Rowan has been exploring this evening. So it remains for me, on behalf of everyone here, Rowan, to thank you for your not just engaging lecture, your difficult lecture, but your embodied lecture, the you that presents this, that illuminates and questions and is always non-dogmatic and yet always pointed. And we appreciate it enormously. And thank you for coming to Durham today. Thank you very much.